Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Today, we're taking you on a detailed mission to trace the complex, cross-cultural history of carpets.
Right, and the sources we're examining for this deep dive, they span an enormous breadth of human civilization. We're going from ancient permafrost tombs in Siberia to the royal courts of the 16th century and all the way to modern industrial hubs in the American South.
Yeah, because you likely walk on carpets every day. I mean, you might literally be standing on one right now
Yeah.
while listening to this, but we rarely pause to consider that these textiles are, well, they're intricate historical documents.
Exactly. Every knot, every thread, every choice of dye, it records trade routes, religious shifts, tribal identity, and technological evolution. We're going to read those documents today.
So to find the dawn of woven floors, we really have to go back to the Neolithic period. The earliest evidence of textile production we have points to Pazyryk in Anatolia.
Yeah, which is roughly between 7,100 and 5,700 BCE.
Right. And when archaeologists excavated Pazyryk, they found impressions and even actual fragments of woven textiles.
And for a long time, researchers just assumed that early weaving relied almost entirely on flax fibers, to make linen.
That would make sense, yeah.
But the findings at Pazyryk were different. The sources indicate these were made from oak bast fibers.
Wait, map this out for me. Because when I think of an oak tree, I think of solid wood. How are people in 7000 BCE weaving a tree into a mat?
It's an incredibly labor-intensive process. So bast fiber comes from the phloem, which is the inner bark of the tree. It's the tissue that conducts nutrients up and down the trunk.
Okay, so not the hard exterior bark.
Exactly. To get to it, you have to peel that outer bark away.
Yeah.
Then you take that inner layer and you soak it in water for an extended period. It's a process called retting.
Redding, got it.
Right, and this rots away the cellular tissue. It just leaves only the long, strong, flexible fibers behind. You dry those fibers, separate them, and then, you can weave them. The people of Pazyryk were taking these local oak bast fibers and interlacing them to create mats that likely served as their early floor coverings.
That is just a massive amount of effort. But I guess moving forward to Old Kingdom Egypt, around 2500 BCE, we see reed mats becoming common. The sources say they were highly durable, functional floor coverings for homes and temples.
Yeah, they were so integral to daily life that we actually see them depicted in the stone reliefs on offering tables inside Egyptian tombs.
Right, because the environment always dictates the craft, right? In the marshes of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, reeds and rushes were just abundant.
Abundant and relatively easy to harvest and plate. But as you move into the 3rd millennium BCE, sheep domestication really takes hold in Mesopotamia, and the region's economy shifts heavily toward wool production.
And wool changes the equation entirely.
It really does. Wool offers significantly better heat retention than reeds or bast fibers. It compresses and bounces back, which, makes it more comfortable to walk or sit on.
Right, it has that cushion.
Exactly. And crucially, it absorbs dye far better than plant fibers, which opens up an entirely new avenue for visual expression.
But the problem with wool, and plant fibers for that matter, is that they rot. Which brings us to a really fascinating architectural workaround in Assyria, right around 700 BCE.
Yes, the Assyrian palace architecture. They feature these massive stone threshold slabs, but they are elaborately carved to imitate woven carpets.
Yeah, you see these slabs placed at doorways where people would transition from one room to another. The stone is carved with intricate borders, repeating geometric rosettes and floral fringes that literally mimic the tassels of a rug.
And you have to ask, why invest immense backbreaking labor into carving a stone to look like a rug instead of just putting a rug there?
Right, why not just use a real carpet?
Because textiles are perishable, especially in the harsh climate of Mesopotamia. The fact that the Assyrian elite demanded their stonemasons perfectly replicate carpet patterns tells us something vital about their society.
That actual woven textile floor coverings were highly valued status symbols.
Precisely. They were the luxury goods of the era. The elite wanted the visual prestige of those textiles permanently rendered in stone because the physical rugs themselves simply decayed over time.
And that decay is exactly what makes the artifact we need to talk about next so deeply significant. The Pazyryk carpet.
Oh yes, the Pazyryk carpet.
The one Sergei Ivanovich Rudenko pulled out of the ice in 1947. This is from a Scythian burial mound in the Altai Mountains of Siberia.
The Pazyryk carpet is the oldest known completely preserved hand-knotted rug in existence. It dates from the 5th to the 4th century BCE. We have fragments of other textiles from antiquity, sure, but nothing like this.
And the reason it survived is purely due to an environmental fluke, right?
Completely. The tomb was looted shortly after the burial, and the looters left a hole. Water seeped through that hole, pooled at the bottom where the carpet was, and froze into a permafrost ice lens. It essentially cryopreserved the organic material.
That is wild. Let's detail exactly what we're looking at with this artifact. The carpet measures 183 by 200 centimeters, so roughly 6 by 6.5 feet. But the staggering metric here is the knot density. The sources say it contains 360,000 knots per square meter.
We really need to pause and consider the sheer mechanics of that number. A knot in a carpet is tied by hand. The weaver takes a short piece of colored yarn, wraps it around two vertical strings, which we call the warp, pulls it tight, and cuts the end.
Right.
So to achieve 360,000 knots in a single square meter means the yarn has to be spun incredibly fine. And the weaver's fingers are performing a microscopic, repetitive task thousands upon thousands of times. It represents months of continuous, highly skilled labor.
And visually, the sources describe it as just a masterpiece. It has a deep, vibrant red field. Within that field are rows of 4 by 6 identical square frames. Each frame contains a star-shaped ornament made of overlapping cross patterns.
And the borders are even more complex. The main field is framed by a border of griffins. Moving outward, there's an inner main border showing a procession of deer, or elk, grazing.
Yeah.
Then there's an outer border depicting warriors on horseback. Some of the men are riding the horses, while others are walking alongside, leading them. And if you look closely at the source images, the saddle cloths on the horses are woven in distinctly different geometric designs.
Finding the Pazyryk carpet in that frozen tomb is like unearthing a complex, fully engineered cathedral with absolutely no evidence of simpler stone churches preceding it.
That's a great analogy.
Right. The sheer knot density and the elaborate pictorial design imply generations, if not centuries, of prior technological evolution. People had to learn how to spin the wool, how to build the loom, how to formulate the dyes, and map out a complex grid design. All of those earlier, cruder prototypes simply decayed into dust.
That is the frustration and really the allure of textile archaeology. We only have the masterpiece. We are completely missing the rough drafts.
Because it's so advanced, there's a massive debate among historians over where it actually came from. The Scythians who were buried with it were nomads. Could they have produced something this complex?
That is the core of the academic contention in the sources. The origins of the Pazyryk carpet are heavily debated. One prominent theory, supported by scholars like Ulrich Schermann and Volkmar Gonshorn, argues for an Armenian origin.
Okay, what is their evidence for that?
They point to several technical and visual markers. First, the carpet utilizes the Armenian double knot. This is a specific way of wrapping the yarn around the warp threads that provides immense durability. Second, they analyze the deep red dye. Chemical analysis suggests it is derived from Armenian cochineal.
Cochineal. We are talking about the insect dye, correct?
Yes. Armenian cochineal is a specific scale insect that lives on the roots of certain grasses in the Ararat plain. You harvest these tiny insects, dry them, and crush them to extract carminic acid, which yields this brilliant crimson red.
So it's a highly specialized local knowledge.
Exactly. Furthermore, these scholars argue that the figures on horseback closely resemble the Armenian delegation that is carved into the stone tribute reliefs at the ruins of Persepolis.
But the sources present an opposing viewpoint as well.
They do. Other historians argue it was a Persian Achaemenid product. They cite the overall stylistic decoration, which shares visual vocabulary with Persian art. They also point to the specific type of horse depicted in the borders, arguing it closely resembles the Nisan breed, which was highly prized by the Persians.
So we have differing academic viewpoints on the origin, and we're not here to take a side or settle that debate, but rather to highlight what the debate itself tells us.
Right, because regardless of who made it, the implications are huge.
Exactly. Whether the Scythian noblemen acquired this carpet through trade with the Persians, or if it was crafted in the Caucasus region by Armenians, it proves that highly complex, knotted pile carpets were already mature, valuable commodities circulating among the elites of the ancient world.
Precisely. The techniques seen in the Pazyryk carpet did not vanish with the Scythians or the Persians. They were carried across continents. And to understand how this craft evolved over the next few millennia, we have to look at the people who carried it, the nomadic tribes of Central Asia.
Let's examine the Turkmen tribes. We're talking about groups like the Yamut, the Ersari, the Sarik, the Salur, and the Take. These are nomadic pastoralists living on the steppes of Central Asia. And for them, carpet weaving was not about creating a luxury item for a palace.
No, it was entirely utilitarian. They lived in yurts, which are circular tents made of felt over a wooden framework. In a yurt, textiles are literally the architecture of the interior. The Turkmen wove tent rugs for the floor to insulate against the cold ground. They wove heavy door hangings to block the wind. They wove camel trappings for their livestock. And they wove bags of various sizes called shavals or torbas, which function like the cabinets and drawers of a modern home, used for storing bedding, utensils, and clothing.
Now hold on. If you are a nomadic tribe, constantly packing up your camp to follow the grazing patterns of your herds, you cannot have a massive, heavy wooden loom. You can't build a permanent workshop. How are they physically weaving these dense, complex textiles?
The physical constraints of the nomadic lifestyle dictated the technology. They used portable horizontal looms.
Walk me through what a horizontal loom looks like in a nomad camp.
Well, imagine two heavy wooden beams, or ribs. You lay them flat on the ground, parallel to each other, maybe 6 feet apart. You drive wooden pegs into the earth to secure them tightly. Then you take your foundational string, the warp, and you loop it continuously back and forth between those two beams until you have a tight, flat bed of strings hovering just above the dirt.
Sort of like stringing a massive guitar.
Very similar, yeah. The tension is critical. The weaver sits directly on the woven part of the rug, working their way forward, tying knot after knot. Now, the ingenuity of this design is its portability.
Because they have to move.
Right. When the season changes and it's time to migrate, the weavers simply pull up the pegs. They roll the unfinished rug and the warp strings right around the wooden beams, pack the whole bundle onto a camel, and set off. When they reach the next pasture, they unroll it, peg it back into the earth, retension the strings, and pick up right where they left off.
But they're doing this entirely off the land. They do not have supply chains.
They rely entirely on their immediate environment. The yarn comes from their own herds of sheep, goats, and camels. They shear the animals, clean the wool, and spin it by hand, often using drop spindles while they're walking or tending the flocks.
And what about the colors? How are they dyeing the wool while moving across the steppe?
They forage. They rely on natural vegetable dyes derived from the local flora. Madder root for reds and oranges. Indigo, which they often had to trade for blues. Weld or chamomile for yellows.
Okay.
They would boil the wool in large pots over open fires with these plant materials, using mordants like alum to fix the color to the fiber.
Given that they're rolling up the loom, moving camp, spinning different batches of wool, and mixing dyes in different environments, the final product cannot possibly be uniform.
It's not. Irregularities are a hallmark of nomadic weaving. A batch of wool might stretch differently after being rolled up, subjected to changing humidity on a camel's back and retensioned at a new camp. This can cause the carpet to have slightly uneven edges or lie a bit crooked on the floor.
And the dye batches would vary too, right?
Absolutely. A new batch of madder root gathered in a different valley might have a slightly different chemical makeup, or the water at the new camp might have a different mineral content. When they dye the next batch of wool, the red might be half a shade lighter or darker than the previous batch.
So you'd see a line.
Yes. When you weave that new wool into the carpet, you get a visible horizontal line where the color shifts. In the carpet world, this color variation is called a brash.
It's fascinating because, from a purely modern industrial standpoint, an uneven edge or a sudden color shift is a flaw. It's a defect. But in these tribal rugs, the sources show it creates a highly sought-after, distinctive aesthetic.
It provides a human texture. I mean, a machine-made carpet is perfectly uniform, and because of that, it can feel visually dead. The abrash, the slight asymmetrical quirks, they are the fingerprints of the environment and the movement of the tribe. It's a visual rhythm.
Speaking of visual rhythm, we have to discuss the gull motif. If you look at a Turkmen carpet, you see these repeating geometric shapes.
The word gull translates roughly to flower or rose, but visually it's an octagonal, highly stylized emblem. These gulls are arranged in repeating rows across the field of the carpet. And they aren't just decorative, they serve as tribal identifiers. They're essentially a woven coat of arms.
So if I'm walking through a bazaar in Central Asia a few hundred years ago, I can look at a rug and immediately know which tribe wove it.
A trained eye certainly could. For example, the Tek tribe utilized a specific gull that is often referred to in the West as the Bukhara design. It's usually quartered, alternating colors in each quadrant.
Okay.
The Ersari tribe, on the other hand, utilized a much larger, bolder, more rounded motif that is often colloquially called the elephant's foot design. The variations in the borders and the specific proportions of the gulls communicated identity and lineage.
And these tribal weaves didn't stay isolated on the steppes of Central Asia. They entered the global economic bloodstream via the Silk Road. Formalized trade along the Silk Road began around 139 BCE, and carpets were the ideal trade good for this network.
They are highly durable. You can roll them up tightly, stack them on a pack animal, and transport them thousands of miles without them breaking, unlike ceramics or glass. And because they represented immense labor, they held extremely high.
High value, yeah. The sources show they effectively became a form of currency. We see them used as diplomatic gifts to secure alliances between empires. They became the ultimate status symbols in foreign courts from Europe to China.
And as they physically moved along the Silk Road, they absorbed and transmitted culture. A massive cross-pollination of motifs occurred. You begin to see Chinese dragon motifs and Taoist cloud bands appearing in rugs woven in Central Asia or Persia.
That is so interesting, the blending of symbols.
You see the Persian bote symbol, that distinctive teardrop shape with a curved upper end, which later evolved into what we know as the Paisley pattern, traveling eastward into Indian textiles. The carpets were quite literally weaving different cultures together.
The religious landscape also deeply influenced production. As Islam spread, the empires that followed, specifically the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, elevated a very specific type of weaving, the prayer mat.
The prayer mat serves a strict, physical, functional purpose in Islam. It provides a clean, dedicated space for the daily prayers. But under the patronage of these vast dynasties, the prayer mat exploded in artistic complexity.
Visually, how does a prayer mat differ from a standard tribal rug?
It features a directional design. Instead of a repeating pattern of gulls that looks the same from any angle, a prayer mat has a definite top and bottom. It usually features a mihrab, which is a woven representation of the arched niche found in a mosque wall. When praying, the user points the apex of the woven mihrab toward Mecca.
The Ottoman Empire, in particular, produced prayer mats that became legendary for their quality.
Turkish prayer mats became a sign of immense wealth, far beyond the Islamic world. They were traded extensively into Europe. In fact, many of the European nobles who acquired them didn't even use them on the floor.
Really?
No, they considered them far too valuable to walk on, so they hung them on the walls as tapestries or draped them over tables to display their wealth.
We're seeing a major transition here. We're moving from the rustic, highly symbolic, utilitarian tribal weaves of the nomads to the centralized, highly controlled production of the great imperial courts. The limitations of nomadic weaving, the small horizontal looms, the reliance on foraging, the inability to plan massive, intricate curves, all of that is about to be shattered by the sheer wealth and resources of centralized empires.
This brings us to what is widely considered the golden age of court carpets. We begin in Persia, during the Safavid era, which spanned from 1501 to 1722.
The German art historian Kurt Erdmann referred to this specific period as the carpet design revolution, and a revolution requires funding. This shift was heavily subsidized by the royal court, particularly under Shah Abbas I. He established massive royal workshops in his new capital city of Isfahan.
By establishing permanent workshops, you eliminate the constraints of the nomad. You can build enormous, heavy, vertical looms that stay in one place. You can source the absolute finest wool and silk from across the empire. You can employ specialized dyers who perfectly control the chemistry of the colors.
And that infrastructure allowed for a profound shift in design. The Safavid weavers moved away from the rectilinear geometric patterns that the nomadic tribes had used for centuries. Instead, they introduced large central medallions, intricate sweeping arabesques, and highly complex curvilinear floral patterns.
These designs were deeply symbolic. They were designed to mimic paradise gardens. In Islamic tradition, paradise is often described as a lush, walled garden with flowing water and abundant flora. The Safavid court carpets brought that eternal springtime indoors, rendering the garden in wool and silk.
But mechanically, how do you do that? You can't improvise a perfect, symmetrical, sweeping arabesque on a loom using only your memory. The nomads memorized geometric goals, but these curvilinear designs are infinitely more complex.
You can't improvise it. To execute these curvilinear designs, a fundamental shift in production methods was required. This era introduced the rug cartoon.
What exactly is a rug cartoon?
It is a paper template. A master court painter would draft the design on paper. Then, that design is transferred onto a large grid. Every single tiny square on that grid represents a single knot of a specific color.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is a monumental shift. The introduction of the rug cartoon completely divorced the weaver from the design process. For millennia, the nomad sitting at the horizontal loom was the sole artist. They made the design decisions knot by knot, line by line. But in the Safavid court workshops, the weaver became an executor of a royal painter's vision.
The division of labor is stark. The painter drafted the cartoon. A caller would often stand by the loom and read the grid out loud, calling out the colors and the number of knots, while a row of weavers sitting side by side followed the instructions simultaneously.
That system allowed for unprecedented scale and precision, and the absolute pinnacle of this era is the Ardabil carpet. The sources detail its creation in 1539 in the city of Kashan, woven by a master artisan named Maksud. It was commissioned by Shah Tahmasp for the Sheikh Asafi Mosque.
The dimensions of the Ardabil carpet are massive. It measures 534 by 1,152 centimeters.
Oh, that's huge.
We're talking about roughly 34.5 feet long by 17.5 feet wide.
And the labor involved is staggering. It took 5 weavers working simultaneously on this massive vertical loom for 3 entire years to complete just one carpet. The coordination required to maintain even tension and perfectly align the complex medallion design across that span of time and multiple pairs of hands is incredible.
And the Safavid influence didn't stop at the Persian borders. The imperial aesthetic spread. Emperor Akbar brought Persian techniques and master artisans to India, establishing royal workshops in Agra and Lahore. This effectively birthed the Mughal Indian carpet tradition.
The Mughal tradition built upon the Persian foundation, but pushed the materials to the absolute extreme. This reached its zenith under Shah Jahan, who is most famous for building the Taj Mahal. The sources highlight a specific surviving Mughal carpet from his court, circa 1650.
The specifications on this 1650 Mughal carpet defy beliefs. The foundational warp and weft threads are made of silk, which is strong and can be spun very fine. But the pile itself, the knots that make up the visual surface, was made using pashmina goat hair.
Pashmina is the undercoat of the Himalayan mountain goat, correct? The fiber that protects them from the extreme high-altitude cold.
Yes, and it is incredibly fine. Each pashmina fiber measures almost 1/6 the width of a human hair. By using a material this microscopically thin, the Mughal weavers achieved knot counts that are almost impossible to comprehend.
Let's put it in perspective. A standard high-quality carpet might have 50 to 100 knots per square inch. The 1650 Mughal carpet has an average of 672 knots per square inch. And the sources note that some examples from this era actually exceed 2,000 knots per square inch.
Think about the physical toll it takes on a weaver. Tying 2,000 microscopic knots into a single square inch of fabric. The eye strain, the dexterity required of the fingers, it is a level of opulence that demands total mastery over human labor.
But it raises a question. Why did the Mughals prioritize pashmina goat hair over silk for the pile? In almost all other cultures, silk is the ultimate, undisputed luxury fiber. It shines, it is smooth. Why use goat hair?
It comes down to tactile interaction and dye saturation. Remember, the pile is the part of the carpet you physically touch, the part you sit on, and the part you walk upon. Silk is smooth, but pashmina provides a softer, warmer, more luxurious tactile experience.
Oh, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the chemistry of the fiber means that pashmina goat hair yields beautifully saturated, deep colors when dyed. The colors sink into the fiber differently than silk, allowing the weavers to act more like painters.
Which perfectly aligns with the defining aesthetic of Mughal carpets, the flower style.
The genesis of the flower style traces back to Emperor Jahangir's visit to the Valley of Kashmir in 1620. He was overwhelmed by the natural beauty and the spring blooms. He brought along his favorite natural history painter, a man named Mansour.
Mansour produced over 100 highly detailed, naturalistic botanical paintings of the local flora. Irises, tulips, lilies, and these botanical profiles were then translated directly onto the looms via the rug cartoons.
But to achieve that naturalism in a woven textile, the weavers had to invent new techniques that utilized complex methods like shading and color mixing. In earlier carpets, you might see a red flower separated from a blue background by a stark black outline.
Right, like a stained glass window.
Exactly. But the Mughal weavers discarded those harsh outlines. Instead, they would juxtapose closely related tones to create a three-dimensional sculptural effect. They would mix tiny pashmina knots of pink and white in a checkerboard fashion to create smooth, natural gradients on the petals of a woven rose.
It's literal painting with knots. The Mughal and Safavid traditions represent the absolute peak of organized, resource-heavy court production. They built upon centuries of regional textile knowledge, scaling it up with imperial wealth. But while Persian and Indian weavers evolved their craft from established regional traditions, the sources present a fascinating outlier. Another region birthed a highly complex carpet style seemingly out of thin air.
You're referring to the enigma of the Mamluk carpets.
The Mamluk carpets suddenly appeared in Cairo during the late 15th century, primarily under the rule of Sultan Shaban and Sultan Bey. Visually, they look absolutely nothing like the sweeping floral arabesques of Persia or the naturalistic flowers of India.
No, they're characterized by a highly intricate, almost kaleidoscopic play of geometrical forms. The central motif is almost always an intersecting star polygon, surrounded by smaller geometric medallions and cypresses, radiating outward in a perfectly balanced grid.
What makes them an enigma to historians is the sheer number of technical anomalous they present. Every element of their construction seems to contradict itself. First, the wool is S-spun.
In yarn production, when you're spinning the fiber, you can twist it to the right, which creates a Z shape in the yarn, or you can twist it to the left, creating an S shape. S-spun wool is highly specific to Egypt and certain parts of North Africa, so the material itself is undoubtedly local to Cairo.
However, the knots used to tie the pile are asymmetrical Persian knots. And asymmetrical knots were not native to Egyptian textile traditions. They used local wool, but a foreign knot. Furthermore, the dye used to achieve their brilliant, defining red color is lac.
Lac is a resinous secretion produced by certain insects, similar to cochineal, but it is imported all the way from India. This is strange because almost all other carpet-producing groups in the Middle East use madder root for their red dye, which was widely available and cheaper.
Right.
The Mamluks chose to import an expensive Indian insect dye to use on Egyptian wool tied with a Persian knot.
And despite the incredible mathematical complexity of the geometric patterns, the color palette is remarkably constrained. Most Mamluk carpets employ a minimal three-color scheme: crimson red from the lac, a medium blue, and an emerald green. Occasionally you see touches of yellow, but it's primarily a three-color interplay.
The precision required to weave perfectly proportioned intersecting star polygons using an asymmetrical knot is exceptionally high. You have to maintain a strict 1-to-1 ratio of warp to weft threads, or the geometry distorts. If your tension is off even slightly, a perfect star becomes an elongated oval.
So we have this masterwork of geometry and tension appearing in Cairo. We have to consider the mystery here. There is no known Egyptian pile weaving antecedent. There are no crude, early versions of Mamluk carpets found in the archaeological record. They just suddenly appear in the historical timeline, immaculately woven and fully realized.
Right.
The academic sources, including scholars of Islamic art like Esenatil, note that this contradicts almost all other artistic traditions in human history, which usually evolve through awkward experimental stages.
Because there's no woven evolutionary chain, the leading theory to explain this sudden appearance involves examining other Mamluk artistic media from the same time period. When you look at the intersecting star polygon designs on the carpets, they perfectly mirror the illuminated end pages of Mamluk Qurans.
During the reign of Sultan Shaban, heavily illuminated Qurans were produced for the royal Waqf endowments. These were charitable trusts attached to madrasas and mosques in Cairo. The calligraphers and illuminators spent immense time designing complex geometric pages.
Additionally, the vibrant, glowing three-color palette of the carpets closely mimics the tones of Mamluk architectural stained glass from the same era.
So the visual vocabulary existed in paper and glass. But how did it get translated to a knotted pile carpet?
The prevailing hypothesis, supported by scholars like Walter Denny, is a story of state-sponsored migration. The theory posits that Sultan Bey actively recruited highly skilled Turkmen craftsmen who were emigrating from the city of Tabriz.
Okay, so the Persian knot makes sense now.
Exactly. These were master weavers who already knew how to tie the asymmetrical Persian knot. They were brought to Cairo, handed the local S-spun Egyptian wool, provided with imported Indian lac dye, and given a specific task.
They were instructed to execute local Cairene book illumination designs on their looms. The goal wasn't to make Persian carpets in Egypt, but to synthesize a highly profitable, entirely unique Mamluk brand for elite export and court use.
It is a remarkable synthesis of foreign labor and local design.
I want you to consider the sheer cognitive leap required of those Turkmen weavers. They had to take a flat paper manuscript illumination, a design drafted by a calligrapher using a compass and a ruler to ensure perfect geometric intersecting lines, and translate that into a woven grid on a loom using hundreds of thousands of knots.
Yeah.
And they had to do it without any prior transitional experiments in that specific style. It's a monumental feat of spatial translation.
It really speaks to the immense, adaptable skill of those migrating weavers. They possessed the fundamental mechanics, and the Sultan provided the vision and the capital. And this desire to produce, own, and trade these intricate, high-status objects eventually spread far beyond the Islamic world. The European fascination with Oriental carpets sparked an era of intense emulation and eventually the push toward industrialization.
Let's follow the trade routes westward. The emulation of Eastern carpets began early in Europe. In the 13th century, we see the emergence of Spanish mudejar weaves. The Moors in the Iberian Peninsula blended Islamic geometric artistry with local Spanish wool resources, creating the first significant pile weave manufacturing center in Europe.
But the true institutional emulation, the organized, state-sponsored attempt to rival the East, occurred in France. In 1608, King Henri IV granted a specific license to a man named Pierre Dupont to manufacture carpets in the Levant style.
And by 1627, his successor, Louis XIII, expanded this by giving a royal privilege to Dupont and his pupil, Simon Lordet.
They set up their carpet business in an old soap factory outside Paris. And the French word for soap is savon. This building gave its name to what would become the legendary savonnerie manufactory.
The savonnerie wasn't established just for artistic expression. It was established as an economic weapon. The French crown wanted to rival Eastern imports and stop French capital from flowing out of the country to the Ottoman and Persian empires. They wanted the luxury revenue kept at home.
They were so serious about this that a protectionist law was passed, prohibiting the importation carpets from the East entirely, safeguarding the savonnerie monopoly.
But while the Spanish mudejar weavers closely copied Islamic geometry, the French took a different approach. They employed the mechanics of the East, specifically using the guillardes knot, a symmetrical knot commonly used in Turkish rugs, but the designs were entirely European. They completely discarded the gulls and the mihrabs.
Instead, they wove heavy acanthus scrolls, classical architectural motifs, floral swags, and the coats of arms of the French nobility. They adapted the technology to reflect their own cultural iconography.
The production was intrinsically tied to the crown. In 1663, Louis XIV's powerful Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, took direct control over the aesthetics. He stipulated that a painter from the Royal Academy had to oversee all carpet designs and teach drawing to the manufactory staff.
This ensures absolute conformity to the royal taste. Louis XIV subsequently commissioned a monumental order of 93 massive carpets to line the floor of the Louvre's Grand Gallery. This singular commission cemented the savonnerie carpet as a fixture of European royal opulence.
While the French focused heavily on royal monopolies and massive singular masterpieces for the palace, the British took a very different approach. They focused on industrializing the process, seeking to increase speed and lower costs.
In 1755, a British weaver named Thomas Whitty invented the Axminster loom in Devon. This loom allowed for the production of multicolored, hand-knotted style pile carpets that mimicked the intricate Oriental patterns. But because of the mechanics of the loom, they could be made much faster using local English wool.
Following the Axminster, we see the development of the Wilton looms. The Wilton mechanics adapted velvet weaving technology. Instead of individual knots, the yarn is woven continuously over wires to produce durable, looped pile carpets. When the wires are pulled out, the loops remain.
Right, and if the wires have blades on the end, pulling them out slices the loops, creating a cut pile.
But the major industrial leap, the one that really accelerates mass production, came in 1839 when James Templeton patented the chenille process in Glasgow.
The chenille process is fascinating mechanically. It involves weaving the carpet twice. First, you weave a blanket of yarn. Then you cut that blanket into long, fuzzy strips. These strips look like hairy caterpillars, which is why it is called chenille, the French word for caterpillar.
And then what do you do with the caterpillar strips?
You take those furry strips and you use them as the weft, the horizontal yarn, in a second moving process. You weave them into a sturdy backing. This process allowed for the efficient, mechanized production of incredibly soft, thick, multicolored pile carpets without the need to tie a single hand knot.
This mechanization boosted British exports globally. And more importantly, it forever changed how carpets were consumed. The speed of the Wilton and chenille looms meant prices plummeted. Carpets were no longer solely the domain of kings, sultans, and wealthy merchants. The rising middle class could now afford to cover their floors.
Now, if we shift our focus across the Atlantic to the Americas during the same era, we find an entirely different indigenous tradition of textile production, one that underwent its own complex evolution, deeply tied to the land and heavily impacted by colonization. The Navajo weaving tradition in the American Southwest is a prime example.
The archaeological and anthropological sources note that Pueblo influences on Navajo weaving predate the 1500s. The Navajo learned early upright loom weaving techniques from the Pueblo people.
Initially, they wove using cotton, which had been cultivated in the region and further introduced by the Spanish. However, as the Navajo acquired sheep, specifically the hardy churro sheep, they shifted their entire textile production to wool.
But to truly understand Navajo weaving, one must understand their origin philosophy. For the Navajo, the loom is not merely a wooden tool used to produce a commodity, it's a sacred construct. According to Navajo oral history, the duality of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman is central to the very existence of the craft.
The sources detail how Spider-Man conceptually created the loom itself, and the components of the loom represent the cosmos. He built it using a sky cord for the upper cross pole, tying it to the heavens. He used an earth cord for the lower pole, anchoring it to the ground.
And he used sun rays for the warp sticks, lightning to fasten the warp, a sun halo for the lower strings, and a rock crystal heel to separate the threads.
The loom is a microcosm of the universe, and it was Spider-Woman who took that loom and taught the Navajo the actual physical process of weaving the textiles. This dualism establishes a profound spiritual connection to the earth, the weather, and the deities. The act of weaving is viewed as a physical transformation of what nature offers to sustain life.
The history of Navajo textiles is generally classified into three transition periods by Western historians. First is the Classic period, which lasted until about 1875. During this time, the Navajo wove primarily for their own personal use, creating items like the iconic chief's blanket, which were highly prized, wearing blankets woven tight enough to repel water.
Then came the transitional period. This era was defined by profound trauma. It followed the devastating forced exile of the Navajo people by the United States government to Bosque Redondo in the late 1860s.
When the Navajo were finally permitted to return to their ancestral lands, their herds of churro sheep had been largely decimated. They lost their source of wool. To survive and continue weaving, they had to rely on commercial, machine-spun yarns and harsh aniline dyes provided by the U.S. government and the newly established trading posts.
This reliance on the trading posts directly leads into the rug period, driven heavily by the arrival of the railroad and traders in the 1880s. The white traders realized that American Easterners coming in on the trains didn't want wearing blankets. They wanted floor rugs for their Victorian homes.
The traders actively and aggressively altered the aesthetic of the Navajo weavers. They refused to buy traditional blankets and instead encouraged the weavers to use heavier, thicker weaves suitable for floors.
And beyond the physical weight of the textiles, they interfered with the designs. To cater to the prevailing Victorian tastes of the time, the traders actually showed the Navajo weavers printed paintings of oriental carpets from Persia and Turkey.
Really, just handed them pictures of Persian rugs.
Exactly. They encouraged the Navajo to abandon some of their traditional banded aesthetics and instead incorporate Eastern geometric motifs and borders into their Southwestern designs.
This dynamic represents a stark, almost jarring contrast in perspectives. On one hand, you have the Navajo philosophical view of weaving, which sees the textile as a sacred living process tied directly to their cosmology, Spider-Woman, and the land. And on the other hand, you have the Western market forces and museum classification systems, which often define Navajo textiles purely by their periods of commercial assimilation and their forced adaptation to the white consumer market.
We're exploring the differing academic viewpoints here in the sources, but the historical consensus shows how external economic pressures can fundamentally alter a traditional art form. However, what is vital to note is that despite the intense commercialization and interference, Navajo weavers maintained their immense technical skill. They adapted the foreign motifs but continued to embed their own cultural identity and mastery into the textiles, ensuring the survival of the craft.
The relentless drive for commercialization and mass production eventually leads us to the floor covering you are likely most familiar with today. The cheap polyester or nylon wall-to-wall carpet you might be standing on right now in 2026 is the direct descendant of a highly specific industrial revolution that took place in a small town in the American South, Dalton, Georgia.
In the 1890s, a teenager in Dalton named Catherine Evans revived a colonial technique called tufting. She initially used it to make bedspreads.
How does tufting mechanically differ from knotting or the chenille process?
Tufting doesn't involve weaving a foundation in a pile simultaneously. In tufting, you start with a pre-woven fabric backing. Evans used unbleached muslin. You thread thick cotton yarn through a needle and you manually punch that needle through the backing. A hook, or looper, catches the yarn on the other side, forming a loop. Then you pull the needle back out.
But if you just punch a thread through a fabric, it's loose. If you pull on the thread, it just rips right back out. How do you secure it?
That was Evans's ingenuity. She would sew thousands of these tufts into the muslin, clip the ends of the loops to make a cut pile, and then she would wash the entire bedspread in hot water. The hot water caused the unbleached muslin fabric to shrink violently.
Ah, I see.
As the backing shrank, it clamped down tight around the cotton tufts, locking them permanently in place.
This cottage industry of hand-tufted bedspreads exploded in Dalton. By the 1930s, machinery was developed to fully automate the tufting process. Instead of a single person punching one needle by hand, massive machines were built with hundreds of needles lined up in a row, rapidly punching yarn through a primary backing simultaneously as the fabric rolled underneath.
After World War II, the final piece of the modern carpet puzzle fell into place. The introduction of synthetic petroleum-based fibers like nylon and polyester completely transformed the Dalton tufting industry. These synthetics were incredibly cheap, took dye easily, and were highly durable.
And the speed of tufting is astronomical. A modern tufting machine can produce a carpet exponentially faster than weaving it on an Axminster or Wilton loom, let alone tying knots by hand. Today, tufting accounts for over 95% of all carpet production in the United States.
The Dalton Revolution entirely democratized the carpet. It took an item that, for thousands of years, required immense manual labor, specialized dye knowledge, and months of time, an item reserved for the nomadic elite, royal courts, or wealthy merchants, and turned it into a mass-produced, inexpensive household staple. The floor covering was no longer a luxury, it became an expectation.
I'm going to hand it over to you to wrap this up. When we look back at this massive timeline, from the Neolithic oak fibers to the nylon loops in Dalton, what is the ultimate takeaway?
If we connect all of these eras to the bigger picture, the realization is that every carpet is a text. Whether it is an ancient artifact locked in ice or a modern commodity sold on a stool, it records the priorities of the people who made it. The Pazyryk carpet records the mobility, the environment, and the cosmology of the Scythians. The Armenian carpet records the immense centralized wealth, the division of labor, and the spiritual garden ideals of the Safavid court. The Navajo rug records the trauma of exile, the harsh realities of the trading post economy, and the profound resilience of adaptation.
It's a literal historical document.
It is. So I leave you with this final thought to consider. Throughout history, a carpet has been a literal record of the environment, the economy, and the spiritual beliefs of its maker. If an archaeologist in the distant future unearths a piece of modern, mass-produced synthetic wall-to-wall carpet from a landfill, perfectly preserved like the Pazyryk carpet in the permafrost, what will that artifact tell them about the values, the speed, and the structure of our current society?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.